Mr. Chairman, I want to thank our witnesses as well, but Mr. Chairman, I want to focus on some of the concerns that I have about this agreement. And I want to start by pointing out a really important fact that we ought to keep in mind. If and when we get to a vote on USMCA in the United States Senate, the choice we'll be making is not between USMCA and nothing. The choice we'll be making is between USMCA and the existing NAFTA agreement. And I say that because the President clearly does not have the constitutional or legal authority to unilaterally withdraw from NAFTA. And NAFTA is in place. It's in place by statute. We should all be very clear about that. It's not going away. The President doesn't have the authority to do that. So the question before us should be, is USMCA a better agreement than NAFTA, or is it not? Now, most of the witnesses here today in their prepared testimony have cited as one of the biggest benefits of the USMCA a reduction in trade policy uncertainty. Governor Blunt, you said that USMCA will, and I quote, help bring much-needed predictability to the auto industry. Mr. Vilsack, you noted that USMCA will benefit the dairy industry, in part by, quote, restoring certainty to U.S.-Mexico trade relations. Mr. Collins, you correctly identified that the positive effects of USMCA found by the International Trade Commission come, and I quote, primarily from the certainty created by USMCA, end quote, because markets abhor uncertainty. That's also a quote. So the question is, where does all the uncertainty come from? It doesn't come from NAFTA. NAFTA is a well-defined agreement we've had for a couple of decades, establishes zero tariffs on 100% of non-agricultural goods, zero tariffs on 97.5% of agricultural goods. There's no uncertainty intrinsic in NAFTA. The only uncertainty is whether people think we might be unilaterally withdrawing from it, and the President has no authority to do that. I think the question we ought to be asking ourselves about USMCA is, do the policy changes in USMCA, do they actually promote growth relative to NAFTA? My colleagues sometimes point to a study from the ITC that shows some very modest gains to economic growth from USMCA. It does. But tellingly, the ITC found that reducing, quote, policy uncertainty accounts for nearly all the gains of the agreement. And if you back out the little tiny boost to GDP of this reduced uncertainty, then the ITC actually found that USMCA would reduce real GDP by a very small amount, but it's not a gain. It's about 0.12%, about $23 billion over 6 years. And that's despite the fact that the ITC's analysis did not attempt to quantify, did not factor in at all, two of the provisions of the USMCA that are virtually guaranteed to increase uncertainty and diminish investment and reduce trade and act as a drag on growth. One is the 16-year automatic expiration date, the sunset provision. The ITC explicitly chose not to try to quantify the effect of that. And the other is dramatic gutting of protections for American investors in Mexico and Canada. How could either of those things provide more certainty? They clearly don't. The sunset provision, this agreement goes away in 16 years unless every one of the parties to the agreement agrees to extend it. We have no certainty that that's going to happen. The investor state dispute settlement mechanism. This is a provision that's in every single free trade agreement we have except for Australia. And it says that if Mexican or Canadian courts treat our investors unfairly, they can seek recourse, including monetary damages. Well, folks, this happens, and it happens in Canada as well as in Mexico. There's a case of a Canadian local government trying to shut down a U.S. application to open a basalt mine by claiming that the mine violated the, quote, core community values of the neighboring town. Core community values was obviously an invention that was meant to discriminate American investors. So the American investor challenged that in the ISDS and won. That's what it's there for, is to prevent discrimination against American investors. And it works. But now we're going to, under USMCA, completely eliminate the investor state dispute settlement mechanism for Canada and virtually eliminate it in Mexico. Now, There are some provisions in the USMCA that I think are constructive modernizations. A digital trade chapter is good. Enhanced IP protections is good policy. Some very modest reciprocal reductions in ag barriers. But it's worth noting that these were all in TPP. These could have been achieved without this. Mr. Chairman, I see I am running out of time, but I just want to say that if we adopt this agreement, it will be the first time that I know of in the history of the Republic that we will agree to a new trade agreement that is designed to diminish trade. The combination of the uncertainty in these provisions and the onerous new costs imposed on Mexican automakers is designed to reduce trade in autos and diminish total trade. I don't think that's what we ought to be doing here, so I would urge my colleagues to think hard before we endorse USMCA.